Welcome to Arise America. I'm Sheila Mcvicar. America's teenagers are mobilizing not under a banner, but with a hashtag, Never Again. They're calling for gun control and safer schools, even as they mourn the students and teachers killed in Parkland, Florida last week. Meanwhile, the sad, steady drumbeat of funerals continues. One of the students buried today was among 3 young heroes being given a Medal of Honor by the U.S. Army. Peter Wang, Elena Petty, and Martin Duke were cadets in the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps. They lost their lives helping to save their classmates. In a tragic irony, the alleged killer was a member of the very same corps. Vigils in memory of the victims are taking place across Florida and across the country. But people are not stopping with thoughts and prayers. Students from across Florida held impromptu walkouts to protest school violence. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School students got on a bus today to go to their state capital, Tallahassee. Some of them were among those hiding in fear as the gunmen stalked the halls. They want to meet with lawmakers tomorrow to demand action to protect their young lives. Said one student, "If you're not with us, you're against us." Yet late today, that legislature refused to revive a bill to ban assault weapons. Meanwhile, new polling shows a majority of Americans want the president and Congress to put an end to mass shootings. A Washington Post ABC News poll conducted after the Parkland shootings last week showed that 6 out of 10 Americans fault Congress and President Trump for not doing enough. It's an indication that the failure to act could have an impact on the outcome of this year's midterm elections. For more on that and other developments in Washington, we turn to Arise News D.C. correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, indications at today's White House briefing that the president is prepared to take some action. What are they planning and how are they going to do it?
Today we heard from the president. He spoke in the White House and he alerted us to the fact that he has actually ordered the Attorney General Jeff Sessions to begin looking into the bump stocks. In fact, he said that he asked the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, to look into this issue after the Vegas shooting. And today he's come back and said that he wants the Attorney General to begin drafting regulations that would actually ban bump stocks. So a bit of breaking news right before we came on the air. Okay, so those bump stocks are what takes a semi-automatic weapon, a legal weapon, and turns it into an automatic weapon, which is, of course, an illegal weapon. And you're suggesting there that it's not going to be a legislative solution, that in fact they're going to look to do regulations and sort of avoid any kind of catch up on the Hill. That's right. In fact, what we saw is that, again, the president likes to do things through executive orders. And so I think that's the area where he is looking at now. Keep in mind, yesterday he did say that he did support legislation that's on the table that's being sponsored by Senator Jeff Cornyn as well as Chris Murphy from Connecticut, 2 senators who have actually witnessed to gun violence in their respective states. But unfortunately, that legislation doesn't go as far as addressing bump stocks. Actually, what it does is it actually just penalizes government agencies who do not update the background check information. This issue today that he talked about, this actually goes much further, and that it actually looks directly at guns and how guns are used to kill so many people.
But there's more polling today, polls out this afternoon, that suggest overwhelming support, better than 90%, for mandatory background checks. Do you think there's any prospect of movement on that?
Well, that's a tricky issue. Because it's just so difficult to see Congress actually move on these issues, very intractable issues. And again, when you have so many members, particularly in the party in power, who have received so much money from the very powerful and influential National Rifle Association, it's just we just have not seen an indication from Congress that they are ready to actually tackle this issue. Now, keep in mind, Congress is out of session. They're not in town this week, so we don't know where they stand with this. Although we have heard from some members, particularly in Florida, have indicated that they are willing to move on the issue, but we just don't know if Speaker Paul Ryan is ready to take this up, and neither is or is the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. We just haven't seen an indication from either of them that they're willing to put this on the docket when they return next week.
So let's go now to the investigation of Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Another indictment today, this time a lawyer tied to former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. What's that about, and what does it tell us?
Yeah, this was an indictment. Many of us thought that we would be seeing Rick Gates actually do the perp walk today, but today, again, in typical Mueller fashion, we saw someone who simply just wasn't on the radar of most of us, and this was a lawyer, Alex Van der Zwaan, who worked for a very prominent law firm that is headquartered out of New York but has offices in London and here in D.C. And so we do know that this gentleman was terminated from this law firm back in September of 2017, and today he was charged with one count of lying to the special prosecutor.
And so presumably the message there from Mueller is that if you lie to me, I'm going to come after you. So don't lie to me.
Correct, and not only that, but we've seen this before with George Papadopoulos, who was charged with lying, as well as Michael Flynn, who also was charged with lying. Now, what's important about the Van der Zwaan plea deal is this is a person who had direct ties to Paul Manafort and also is married to the daughter of a very prominent Russian. In fact, Germany Khan, his father-in-law, is one of the wealthiest men in Russia and across the world. In fact, Forbes lists him as the 135th wealthiest person in the world. And so I think that what we're seeing now is, again, three pillars to this investigation: Paul Manafort, Donald Trump Jr., and Jared Kushner. And we see the heat is really picking up steam in terms of where Mueller is going as it relates to Paul Manafort.
President Trump tweeted a lot of things today, but one tweet says, quote, "I have been much tougher on Russia than Obama. Just look at the facts. Total fake news." First, is this true? And second, why is the president so anxious to be seen to be tough on Russia when he keeps insisting there was no Russian meddling?
Well, just from a factual perspective, Sheila, it's very hard to actually find where the President Trump, that is, has been very tough on Russia. We do know that there was legislation, veto-proof legislation, that was passed by the Congress that this president still has not enacted. And then again, when you look at the tweet storm just from the beginning of the week and over the weekend, we just have not seen this president go after Vladimir Putin and many of the Russians in their engagement in U.S. elections, as we have seen from the Intel community as well as members of Congress. So it just doesn't pass the smell test when he talks about being tough on them. And also remember, President Obama actually implemented sanctions, and then he also kicked out many of Russia's diplomats before he left office.
Got a little less than a minute left, Eric, but there's something else that's exercising Trump today that I wanted to get to, and that's the newly drawn congressional map in battleground state Pennsylvania, which some now think favors the Democrats. Do you think that map is going to stand?
Well, as of right now, it is, and unless the Supreme Court actually expedites the case and decides to hear it very quickly, we do think that this will stand, and this will be the direction that we will see for the midterm congressional elections. And Republicans have a right to be concerned, because when you look at the way this map was drawn, now keep in mind this map was drawn by the courts, and so there was no partisan engagement, but the courts actually drew it in a way where the way it looks right now, as many as 5 seats could go Democratic in the midterm elections, and that could be very troubling for not only the state of Pennsylvania and the GOP there, but also for the midterm elections and who controls the House going into 2019.
And of course, the White House. Thanks, Eric. Another voice in the mix today comes from Dallas, Texas. That's where the National Rifle Association is set to hold its annual convention in May. The city councilman, who is also serving as mayor pro tem, is urging the NRA to move its meeting somewhere else, anywhere else. And as plans for the Young People's Demonstration in Washington take place, they're drawing support from George and Amal Clooney. The celebrity couple announced they're spending $500,000 in the names of their 8-month-old twins, and they plan to join the March for Our Lives on the 24th of next month. U.S. intelligence sources say Russian hackers are now also trying to manipulate the national debate about gun laws. Duarte Geraldino reports on how these Russian software programs, or bots, work, and why government officials say there is no doubt Russia is trying to disrupt the 2018 midterm elections.
Moments after gunshots rang out in the halls of a Florida high school where 17 students and adults were murdered on Valentine's Day, nameless Russian operatives were furiously trying to manipulate American political opinion on social media. Researchers from the watchdog group Alliance for Securing Democracy say a Russian cyber army using blogs, videos, and hashtags like gun control now, gun reform now, and parkland shooting are trying to inflame divisions between Second Amendment advocates and proponents of gun control.
We expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokesmen, and other means to influence to try to build on its wide range of operations and exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States.
Researchers are monitoring 600 Twitter accounts linked to Russian influence operations. To determine which account is actually an automated bot, researchers looked for certain cues, an extremely high volume of posts, for example, or content that obviously matches hundreds of other accounts. But the Russian foreign minister dismisses claims his country is meddling in U.S. affairs, saying, quote, accusations have been made, but no evidence was presented. And yet, according to U.S. Director of National Intelligence Coates, testifying recently before Congress, this latest effort may only be a test run at muddying the political waters in the U.S.
There should be no doubt that Russia perceived that its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations.
And Director of the Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Robert Cardella.
In the months leading up to those midterm elections, you're going to see a heavy effort by local politicians and organizations to help voters decipher what is and what is not fake news. They're trying to mitigate, Sheila, the effects of these Russian operatives.
So we've got all these organizations popping up that are essentially monitoring groups, and there's really 3 groups that they're looking at. We've got Russian hackers, we've got Russian bots, the software, and we've got Russian, I guess, fraudsters, people who are impersonating Americans on Facebook, who are setting up false events or organizing events and candidacies. What's the difference between these 3, and what's the difference between the way that they can be tackled and also their impact?
So first, let's start with the hackers. The hackers, their stated goal is to find information that they can then weaponize during these elections. So this is true information that can be used against candidates.
Right.
And then we have the imposters, the ones who create these fake Facebook and Twitter accounts. They're literally trying to change the way people view certain people, because if you suddenly start saying things that are offensive to me, then I'm going to have a different perspective. So that's what these imposters are trying to do. But the most nefarious of them all are these bots, because these are relentless software programs that are working 24 hours a day to either amplify the effects of fringe groups, really, or to make sure that voices that should be heard are quieted. Now, there are some organizations that are trying to compile a list of some of these fake accounts and identities, but really, as fast as they are working, you have the opposition, these Russian operatives, who are working overtime to develop new and more ingenious ways to really shake the foundation of American democracy.
And clearly able to jump on something when it happens, as in the Parkland.
As we saw this week.
Thanks so much, Duarte. Duarte Geraldino, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Joining us now to talk about Russian interference in the 2016 elections and Russia's continuing efforts to manipulate American public opinion is Sanford Schram. He's a professor of political science at Hunter College, and he's written papers that have examined the question of susceptible voters, or voters who are, in a sense, less informed. But let's begin with this question of bots. What exactly is a bot factory?
Well, the Mueller investigation has revealed that one of the largest, most prominent ones was in St. Petersburg, tied to the Kremlin. Thousands of people working to create these fake Facebook and Twitter accounts that spew out all kinds of false information. And it's not just limited to the Russians. There are other people making money doing it all over the United States and elsewhere in other parts of the world. Sometimes nothing to do with politics. And so this is part of the new architecture of social media, the internet, and how people exchange information, some of it far less reliable than what we're accustomed to.
How do they identify these weak points of contention, these points of division, these points of fracture?
Well, I think it's pretty much an open secret that the United States is a highly polarized and divided country, particularly around issues of diversity and immigration. Our research looks at how, over time, the United States is becoming more polarized around what we're calling outgroup hostility, how people feel about African Americans, immigrants, Muslims, groups like that. And while there are more and more people concerned about diversity in a positive way, there are more and more people that are anxious and resentful about changes in the demographic makeup of the United States and are going in the other direction. We're definitely pulling apart as a country regarding that and making ourselves vulnerable. And so on the Russia question, I don't think they really need to be colluding with a lot of people to know that. That doesn't mean that they didn't get help.
So, as you say, a deeply divided and polarized society where there are clear fracture points. Is it possible that in exploiting these fracture points, these Russian operatives are also increasing the anxiety?
Well, I think they are. I think they're preying upon people's vulnerabilities. And so our research showed that people who aren't that cognizant of basic facts about the political system are more vulnerable to believing falsehoods and were more likely to vote for Trump.
When you look at any kind of propaganda machine, and this would seem to be a pretty sophisticated effort, perhaps not the most sophisticated effort we've ever seen throughout human history, but a pretty sophisticated one. Is it possible to say, or possible to quantify, the influence that this has had on Americans and American voters in particular?
Yeah, I think political scientists have been slow to adjust to the new terrain, but studies are starting to come out. There was a study released this weekend by Ohio State University that shows that fake news probably depressed the vote for Hillary. They looked at 1,600 voters, 585 had voted for Obama, and among those 585 that voted for Obama, only 77% voted for Hillary. Of the remaining people, they split their votes between not voting, voting for Jill Stein or other third-party candidates, and voting for Trump. And those people were more likely to believe popular memes on Facebook and Twitter that were false.
Is it possible to identify who those people are, those people who are more susceptible?
Well, we're pursuing this further. One of the things I would like to do with the data, if I can get a hold of it, is find out if these people were more of these low information voters who were uninformed, who have high levels of anxiety about outgroups, who are more likely to believe conspiracy theories or fake news, and that those are the people who were pulled away from the Democratic Party and voted for Trump.
What do you think is at stake for the American system as we move forward, not only to the midterms later this year, but to the presidential election in 2020?
Right. Well, I think it goes more fundamentally just to the future integrity of our electoral system, the quality of public discourse, and the extent to which we can say that we have a healthy democracy. And so if we can't count on the information we're getting, if we can't trust the people who are telling us things, if we are going to more and more just rely on our own networks and silo in our own little bubble on the internet, on Facebook or Twitter, and only believe the people that we're most associated with, we're just going to be confirming our own pre-existing dispositions and making public discourse that much more tribalistic and divisive. And I really worry about this. I think we need to step up. What we definitely need is political leadership that takes this seriously, not someone who's self-absorbed with just proving that their own election was legitimate and refusing to even deign to consider this a serious issue.
Well, what happens when you have a president who repeatedly attacks reputable news organizations with fake news?
Right. I think Donald Trump is probably one of the most important purveyors of fake news that we have, because he's so influential, being able to use the bully pulpit of the presidency and constantly tweeting out lies and falsehoods. So he's not only not stepping up to address the problem, he is a big part of the problem.
And how do you combat that?
Well, hopefully he'll step aside.
Failing that?
That he'll be impeached.
And failing that?
That people vote him out of office.
Beyond an end to the political career of Donald Trump, what can be done to combat this kind of propaganda?
Well, I think we need political leadership. We need people in Congress that are willing to conduct real investigations and not take their marching orders from Donald Trump in the White House. I mean, Devin Nunes is the opposite of what we need in Congress. Someone who is willing to uphold the law, not violate the law. I mean, Nunes is at risk of going to jail himself for what he's done. I mean, the seriousness of this goes well beyond Donald Trump. The Republican Party is deeply complicit in allowing this to go on, and showing that they're more interested in winning tax cuts, winning deregulation, pleasing their donors, than they are taking care of the quality of our democracy and the well-being of our country.
Sanford Schram, stay with us. We'll come back to you shortly. In northeast Nigeria, a narrow escape for schoolgirls and their teachers. They fled from Boko Haram after hearing gunfire. Militants were heading to their school in the town of Dapchi. While they hid in the bush, the attackers raided the school, but they came away only with food. Another would-be attack was thwarted at the University of Maiduguri. Security forces prevented a suicide bomber from hurting anyone but himself. Any attack on a school brings back the memory of April 2014, when Boko Haram kidnapped more than 270 girls from Chibok. Many of those girls have escaped in the years since, but at least 100 are still believed to be in captivity. To Syria now, in the besieged Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta, where aid agencies say almost 200 civilians have been killed in the past 2 days alone. Casualties of dozens of airstrikes and shelling carried out by forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Amnesty International says flagrant war crimes are being committed, with tens of thousands of civilians trapped in a daily barrage of attacks aimed at killing and maiming them. Hospitals and clinics have been bombed. The suburb, held by Syrian rebels, has been under siege for 6 years, but in recent days the violence has dramatically increased. International organizations, including the United Nations, say that without a ceasefire and safe passage for civilians, eastern Ghouta could become another Aleppo, where hundreds of civilians died.
Bottom line, if we have learned something from Aleppo, time to actually avoid all this and going on in this type of form of tit for tat, in an increasing incremental militarization of the conflict in eastern Ghouta, where civilians are suffering, and in Damascus. Don't forget there's been a lot of shelling on Damascus as well. The only difference is that one group has got better weapons. The tendency of hitting civilians has been very high. Conclusion, let's avoid Aleppo, and we are still in time.
Coming up next, Trump embraces a man who once called him a phony and a fraud. We'll consider their political romance when we come back. Once upon a time, Mitt Romney said he would never accept an endorsement from Donald Trump. But now, Romney is running for one of Utah's 2 U.S. Senate seats. He is expected to easily win the race, but even so, he gratefully accepted the president's endorsement overnight. Their back-and-forth tweets offer one more proof of the old saying, politics makes strange bedfellows. Joining us again is Sanford Schram, political science professor at Hunter College. So go back, 2016, Romney on Twitter. Quote, if Trump had said 4 years ago the things he says today about the KKK, Muslims, Mexicans, the disabled, I would not have accepted his endorsement, talking about his own presidential run in 2012. And also, quote, Donald Trump is a phony, a fraud. His promises are worth less than a degree from Trump University. That was in March 2016 in a speech. Wow, not that many months. Am I just being cynical, or is this just politics as usual?
Well, sometimes Mitt Romney is very truthful. And sometimes less so. I mean, so he's never really liked Donald Trump, was very suspicious of him, was reticent to take his endorsement in 2012. They negotiated over where it would take and when and place and under what conditions, and he's very skittish about it, but he felt he needed his endorsement then, and he feels he needs it now.
Well, Trump did not perform all that well in Utah. And as a matter of fact, there were other candidates who did nearly as well or better than he did. Why does Romney feel that he needs his support?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, Evan McMullin, a former CIA officer who is a staunch Republican but very much critical of Donald Trump, was on the ballot and is a write-in candidate. He did get a lot of votes, but Trump did win Utah. I mean, a lot of people in Utah are Mormons. A lot of Mormons are very devout. They have strong moral values. Mitt Romney, I think, feels he's one of them. They're very suspicious of Donald Trump. But Trump won the state previously.
And on the moral value front, you wouldn't think that they would automatically be Trump voters.
No, and again, it goes back to things I've been saying for a long time now, that I'm shocked about how our politics have shifted so radically, how tribalistic it's become, how polarized it's become, how people are putting party over country. It's all about winning. They see it as a binary choice, as they like to say, so they go with Trump because he's their guy. He's going to give them what they want in terms of their tax cuts, their deregulation, their pro-life policies, what have you, and they're willing to hold their nose and vote for him. And I think Romney feels he has to go along with it.
So you talk about the binary choice, and there's been a lot of commentary about how senior Republicans in Congress and in the Senate in particular have not stood up to Donald Trump, and in fact have seemed to go along with him and been silent about some of his more grievous excesses. Do you think Romney will fit into that mold, or is Romney going to be a senator who will do the president's bidding, or is Romney, as a former presidential candidate, a former governor of Massachusetts, a man of considerable standing in his own right, is he going to go in there with his own agenda and his own moral compass intact?
Well, I guess that's the $64,000 question. It's really hard to say. Romney, I think, has been very strategic all along. He's a very moral person. He has strong values, but he's also a very political person, and he's interested in higher office and has been for a long time. In that sense, he's not that different than Donald Trump. And so it's, I think, going to depend on whether it's going to be to his political advantage to be with Trump or to criticize him.
You know, we saw during the transition period, Trump flirted with Romney to be his Secretary of State very publicly, having dinner with him, sort of auditioning him, and then, of course, putting him aside and choosing Rex Tillerson, something that must have been a deliberate effort at humiliating or getting under Romney's skin. How is that that relationship going to play out, do you think, as if Romney indeed is elected in Utah?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, it's really sad that our politics have become about these kinds of things. I mean, it's distinctly possible Trump decided to run because he felt ashamed by Barack Obama at the press annual dinner a few years ago, and that he was motivated out of spite. And it could be that Mitt Romney will want to get back at Donald Trump. I mean, it's really sad that Trump has sort of taken us down into the gutter like this. We'll have to wait and see.
You know, one of Romney's signature achievements as governor of Massachusetts was to put in mass care, which was effectively a universal single-payer health care system in the state of Massachusetts. What kind of voice do you think he will have in the health care debate, if indeed the health care debate is going to come back up during the remainder of Trump's term?
Yeah, I mean, Romney, again, parses his words so strategically. Like, he claims that Romney Care was not Obamacare because it was at the state's choice. It wasn't a national imposition, and therefore it's different, though in fact they're very similar. And so he says a lot of things that really don't make a lot of sense, except they get him votes. And I think he'll probably continue to talk like that. It'll be dependent upon whether it improves his standing politically or not.
Sanford Schram, political science professor at Hunter College, thanks so much for being with us. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Just ahead, the U.S. markets get back to business, and we get some advice on handling this new era of volatility. You're watching Arise America. U.S. stock market continues to be volatile. The Dow Jones average was down 254 points today. NASDAQ was off 5, and the S&P was down about 16. Even in the down market, Rite Aid is up a bit on news that its remaining stores are being bought by the supermarket company Albertsons. To talk about the roller coaster the markets have been on is Avani Ramnani, Director of Financial Planning and Wealth Management at Francis Financial. Thanks so much for coming in. So we've seen the market go up and down, rallied a bit, didn't have such a great day today, but you know, is the return of the bull market, is this where we are?
You know, the inherent economy is doing really well. We had great numbers come out in January. Unemployment is at a historical low. It's at about 4.1%. It hasn't been this low since 2000. Real wages are finally increasing. So they increased about 2.9% in December over last year. So the inherent economy is doing really well. The fluctuations that we're seeing right now, I feel are more of a healthy correction that the market needed. And we did expect volatility to come around soon. It's just in the last 4 quarters or the past 1 year that we haven't seen volatility. But it's been around, and it'll continue to be around.
So you say with volatility, of course, you have to ask the question, is this the moment for small investors? And I'm not talking about millionaire hedge fund people here, but is this the moment for small investors to be in the market? Should they take that risk? You know, for someone that has a long-term time horizon, this is the perfect time to invest. When the markets are low and you have some cash sitting on the side, you put it in because you know that in the long term the market will go up. But of course, you know, this has to be some investment for the long term where you don't need this cash in the next 1 or 2 years because eventually it is a market cycle. What goes down will come up. And if somebody gets skittish, and clearly some people have gotten skittish, and they've looked at what's happened, especially 2 weeks ago or a couple of weeks ago when the Dow really was on a roller coaster, if someone's skittish, what other kinds of options could they be considering? So the first thing is to not panic. I think that's the key, is yes, you've had a disciplined investment strategy in place, and if you see that your accounts have fallen significantly, the one thing to do is not panic and pull out, because what that does is you're locking in your losses, and then you're always afraid to go back in because you don't know when the market might go back up again or fall some more. So the first thing to do is not to get out of the market. And then you really take a look at, is this the right strategy for me? If the market's volatile, do I lose sleep at night? Then maybe if you're invested too aggressively and it's not for your risk appetite. Thanks, Avani. We'll speak again a little later in this program when we talk about growing wealth at any age. Thanks so much. You're welcome. Now for more on the day in business, here's Arise News correspondent Duarte Geraldino.
Walmart news tops earnings reports out today. The company says holiday sales beat expectations but missed earnings targets. Its shares took a hit. Walmart's blaming the cost of fighting off threats like Amazon's for the drop in price. Gap stock was rocked by the surprise departure of Jeff Kirwan. He's the president and CEO. Fourth quarter results show the company is still trying to bring customers back to brands like Old Navy and Athleta. Airbus is getting a lift from Qatar Airways, which took delivery on the company's new large twin-engine jet today. The company says it might order more of the A350-1000 aircrafts. They carry 366 passengers. And finally, Uber is off the road in Morocco for the time being. The company is suspending operations there after many confrontations between Uber and taxi drivers. Uber has been a popular presence in Casablanca for more than 3 years, but says better regulations are needed to protect drivers from intimidation.
Coming up next, the latest on how sexual misconduct is affecting charity and the Catholic Church. You're watching Arise America. The international charity Oxfam has lost more than 7,000 regular donors since it was revealed last week that staff sexually exploited victims of the Haiti earthquake in 2010. Under questioning by the UK Parliament's International Development Committee today, Oxfam executives also revealed they were now investigating 26 additional reports of sexual misconduct. An original investigation found serious misconduct, including bullying and intimidation, but did not mention sexual exploitation.
Please allow me to begin by saying how sorry I am about what has happened. I'm ashamed. I've spent my life trying to stand up for women's rights and to fight for people living in poverty. So this is painful for me. Some hideous men came into our organization and abused the trust of the British people, the supporters, but they were able to get away, to get a recommendation to leave. This was wrong.
Thank you.
But so we're going to change the culture, and working on the culture costs money, and we're going to put money on this.
Thank you.
Pope's recent visit to Chile reignited the ongoing sexual abuse allegations in the Catholic Church. The pontiff recently agreed to meet with abuse victims in hopes to diffuse some of the tension. Here to help us make sense of what's happening in the Catholic Church is Steve Acunto. He's the Chancellor at Consular Corps College. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Sheila.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So the Pope's recent visit to South America wasn't quite the love fest that many had anticipated, and central to that, one of the major issues was his continuing support for the Chilean bishop, who some accused of having colluded in protection of sexual abusers. Is his decision to meet now with sexual abuse victims and his decision to reinstate the Vatican Commission on sexual abuse a direct response to that?
Well, first of all, we put the trip to Chile in context. The Pope has made a number of trips. They haven't been successful, in my opinion. And in Chile, in each of those instances, he's faced with bishops who are of one mind, and his leading, or priests of one mind, and a bishop who has been appointed by either him or by his predecessor, who is of a different mind. Initially, in each instance, China, Chile, and Nigeria, he supported the incumbent bishop, and in each case, he's had to back down. In the case of China, to the government; the case of Nigeria, to dissident priests in Ahayara province; and in the case of Chile, also to dissident priests.
Is this just a question of tone deafness?
No, it's a question of starting somewhere and going somewhere else. He starts from the idea of supporting someone who's been accused and saying that needs to be proved, and he has to go from there to the exigency of church order. He follows a very dogmatic Pope, Benedict XVI.
Yes.
And to one wing of the church, that's what they wanted. The promise of Francis
was something quite different.
He was supposed to be a reformer. He came from a very different background. His work as a priest was very different. His work as he rose through the ranks of the church was very different.
Yes.
He was not doctrinaire in the way that Benedict was seen to be.
Taking the name Francis itself was indicative. St. Francis, not widely known, actually intervened in a war in Syria. This is a true story. And this Pope held out that promise to so many people. But what he's facing right now, you know, a Pope is infallible in matters of faith and morals, but not in politics and not in diplomacy. And so what he's faced in China, particularly, is that kind of problem. And with this allegations of sexual abuse, I don't think it was a deaf ear. I think it was a case of wanting to believe innocence until proven guilty. And when everything started to wash up, he had to back down. But remember, for him, it was uncomfortable. He backed down in China, backed down in Nigeria, backed down in Chile.
Well, let's talk about China in particular, because in China, it's this discussion that has been going on for a long time between the Vatican and the Beijing government about who should control the church, who has the right to make priests, who has the right to make bishops. And the saw-off seems to be that Beijing won.
The Catholic Church, as you know from English history, has had that problem for many years ago, and it continues. The question of who would appoint bishops goes back to Thomas Becket, and who had that hegemony. In this instance, the church militant and underground in China, of course, held fast to what it believed, to use St. Paul's term. Here, I think he had a choice to make: take care of the flock or take care of the shepherds. The shepherds being the bishops. The flock could probably stand appointments from a Chinese government with the Pope's ability to object to them, which goes back to Roman law, nihil obstat, and so on. But in this instance, it's a back down, because those in the church who were in favor of a more rigid church, a more Benedict XVI-like church, naturally would have wanted him to stand up to the government and maybe have harmed a growing Catholic population.
You know, you have to ask, this Pope is now 81 years old. We saw his predecessor, Benedict, step aside when he feared his own health was failing. The Pope has taken these trips. They are exhausting for anyone, but for a man of that age, particularly so. Do you think that there is any thought being given either in circles around him or to this pontiff himself that perhaps there will come a time to retire as Benedict did?
I don't think he's thinking about it, but there are members of the Curia who have gone on record with saying things that are not directly against the Pope, but who have expressed doubt, who have expressed curiosity, who have bemoaned this or given lie to the conservative wing of the Catholic Church. So I think he will eventually be faced with it. But according to a report I read this morning from London, and I think it was in The Guardian, he has become more enthusiastic rather than less by his visitations. And I mean, you know, we think of the Catholic Church as being a Roman enterprise here in Europe or in North Africa and so on. In actuality, the numbers from the Far East are incredible. And so a Pope going there in the Philippines or going to China or Myanmar, as he was recently, he will find an enormous level of acceptance, fresh acceptance.
An enormous level of enthusiasm, and the Pope as a political figure will probably find that invigorating.
I think so. I hope so. He's a good man. He's a good man. He's in a very difficult place. He's inherited abuse scandals that have bankrupted some dioceses, that have plagued the church, that have made people tentative about it. And he's tried to compensate by liberalizing divorce, the acceptance of divorcees. And I have to say, he's a good man. He's just in a very difficult place.
Steve Acunto, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. Still to come, the difference between having money and building wealth, something everyone needs to know. You're watching Arise America. A royal surprise at London's Fashion Week. At the age of 91, Queen Elizabeth II attended the event for the first time. She joined Vogue's Anna Wintour in the front row for Richard Quinn's show. The designer was due to receive the brand new Queen Elizabeth II Award for British design. Her Majesty wore an Angela Kelly ensemble with some sparkly crystals and a large diamond brooch. Perhaps her dazzle is what prompted Ms. Wintour to keep her sunglasses on. Paying off student loans, saving for a home, and trying to invest can be daunting prospects. Avani Ramnani is back to help us demystify the process to create wealth. She's the Director of Financial Planning and Wealth Management at Francis Financial. Welcome back, Avani.
Thank you.
So this question of investing can be pretty intimidating. Where do you start?
So the first few things to think about are, what are your goals? What are you looking at achieving? And there could be things like saving for children's education, saving for your retirement, saving to buy a home. There are so many different goals that need a different approach. The other thing to think about is, what is your life situation? You could be a single person without any family, or you could be a single earner with a family. You could have double income, no kids, double income with kids. So it really depends on your life situation, what your investment strategy needs to be.
What are the 3 steps you should take when you're thinking about building wealth?
So the 3 big things that you need to think about is, what are you earning?
Right.
How much are you saving from that earning? And then finally, how do you invest this money that you save? So these are the 3 big things. Now, what you are earning is a big part of your wealth creation, because that is where you get paid by doing the work that you do. You use your core skills and you use your talents to generate that income. And then if you spend it all, it really doesn't help, because then you're not saving anything for your future when you will not receive that income. So that's the second piece. And then just how do you invest, keeping in mind what your life situation is and what your goals are.
You know, so many young people these days come out of college crippled by student debt. Many of them are in the gig economy, where they're going from job to job, and we're looking at lower paid jobs, jobs that are in the professional sector perhaps, but aren't as well paid as they were even 10 or 20 years ago. What's the best strategy to deal with those student debts? What should kids do?
Kids should really look at, just lay it all down on paper, see how much they owe, what are the interest rates on each of those loans, can they consolidate that? That's one good strategy to bring some of that interest down. So consolidation is one. And the second piece is, if you have high interest loans, those are the ones you should be targeting first. Because if you have something that's 6%, 7% interest, and you're earning, by investing in the market, you earn 5 or 6%, it really doesn't make sense to save that money and invest in the market when you could be paying off these student debts and saving on that interest.
Does it still make sense to save to buy a house or a condo, or does it depend on where you live?
It depends on where you live. A lot of New York City, you really have to think hard, because sometimes renting may be better. You're better off renting than actually buying.
And using that extra money to invest, basically.
Yes. And there is this concept I strongly believe in, which is good debt versus bad debt. Bad debt is things where you have consumer debt. You take a car that's much bigger or much more expensive than what you can really afford, and then you go into that type of debt. But good debt is for your education, for example, because that enhances your earning power. Good debt is buying a home and taking a mortgage on that home. So you really have to think about those aspects as well.
We've got about a minute left. So what's the one thing you wish Americans understood better about saving and investing?
The one thing I would say is, keep your time horizon in mind. Have a very disciplined approach. The combination of stocks with bonds, you have to think about what is the best combination for you. Even within stocks, what is that combination? Should you invest in U.S. stocks? Should you invest in large companies, small companies, international stocks? There are so many kinds, and you should have a good balance of all these things. And similarly in bonds, there are so many different types of bonds. You should have a good mix of all those different asset classes when you're investing.
Avani Ramnani, thanks so much for all those helpful tips. Thanks for being with us.
Of course.
Thanks so much for watching Arise America in New York. I'm Sheila Mcvicar. We'll see you here tomorrow.